welcome to Christian Answers for today, and I'm happy that you can be along with me today for this program. If you've noticed in the past few weeks, we've been reviewing different television movies that have come up. Last time I talked about the movie Killing Jesus that was shown on the National Geographic Channel. And I was pretty critical of that movie, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm always critical of all of the Bible movies that come out, because I'm not. Many of the movies I really heartily endorse. And this week I'm going to give a review on the first episode of a movie made for TV that I really, really like, and it is called A.D. The Bible Continues, and it was shown on NBC this past Sunday. And if you remember, a couple years ago, there was a series shown on television, the History Channel, called The Bible. And then there was a movie that came out called Jesus. And then this year, by the same producers, there is a series coming out on NBC, a 10 or 12-part series every week called A.D. The Bible Continues. And what this series does is it picks up right at the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it goes into a description of the early church, which is really, really important because we don't often hear about the early church. There aren't a lot of television shows and documentaries about the early church. Usually it focuses on Jesus and the Gospels, but this show is actually going to be a description of the early church and how they struggled against all odds to establish Christianity in the first century. So I wanted to go through the first episode, and I will be commenting on the different episodes from time to time as they come up. Now, this depiction of the Christian movement that started with Jesus and continued through the apostles and then into the early church, this depiction is a little bit different from the last movie I reviewed, in that this presentation actually tries to be faithful to the Bible presentation. It doesn't bring in a lot of records that are non-biblical. It doesn't try to make up stories or even contradict what the Bible says. It tries to follow the Bible basically word for word. Now, there are instances where they take creative license with the story. The Bible, after all, doesn't give all of the details that we would like as far as what actually happened at events and what people actually said. It doesn't give all the details, and so in order to make a television presentation or a movie presentation, you have to have some extra biblical recreations of what happened in the Bible. And the Bible series, this A.D., The Bible Continues, does indeed make sort of extrapolations, or it tries to fill in the gaps that the Bible has in its account of events. But it does so in a way that is faithful to the Bible. I have to say right off the bat that one of the most obvious recreations and with creative license that A.D., The Bible Continues, does is it makes some of the disciples and followers of Jesus, even making, for example, John the Apostle, he is depicted in the movie as African. And it also shows Mary Magdalene as African descent. Now, we all know that John the Apostle was a Jew, a Middle Eastern Jew, and we know that Mary Magdalene was a Middle Eastern Jew also. So we know that they could not have possibly been African, but in an interview with Roma Downey and her husband, who produced the movie, we know that they did this because they wanted to present the history of Christianity in a way that everyone today could relate to. In other words, they wanted people from all corners of the globe. They wanted people from all different races, tribes, and tongues to feel that they were welcomed into the story and into the accounts of Christianity. And they did that by inserting 2 African disciples of Jesus Christ, even though we know for sure, without a doubt, that all of the disciples were, in fact, Jewish. And that's what Jesus chose to be his followers, and those are the people that followed him in the very early time on the Christian faith. But we can overlook that. We can overlook the point that these 2 characters, John and Mary Magdalene, are not exactly as they were in the Bible. That is some kind of a minor change that occurred. Nothing actually changed as far as what they did and what they said. So the Bible series is a very good series. I would highly recommend it because of the way that they try to be faithful to the Scriptures. And they did make some artistic exceptions, as the case I just mentioned. But other than that, it is it tries to be very faithful to the Scripture. It does not try to add things because they think the Bible story needs a little bit of help here and there, like we saw last week in the movie Killing Jesus. There were blatant additions and distortions in that movie. This one does not have them. Now, there are some instances where the producers here in the Bible series do have to fill in the blanks. Of course, we don't have the information that is being filled in because that's why they need to fill in the blanks. The information is not there in the Bible. And so they're trying to do a recreation of what probably took place, and they're guessing as to what the dialogue was, and they're guessing as to what the details were in scenes that they are showing. But again, they tried to do it in a logical, rational way, and they did a pretty good job of it. And so what I'm going to try to do in the next segment is I'm going to try to point out some of the areas where the documentary and the miniseries here does fill in the blanks, and we're going to look at some of their decisions that they decided that probably occurred in filling in those blanks, and we're going to try to analyze and see if they were actually accurate in their depiction of what probably took place in between the lines of the Bible. And we'll find that it's very interesting, some of the questions that they raise as far as who said what and who did what that are not mentioned in the Bible. We will cover in our next segment, so you want to stick around for that. We're going to have fun today. We're going to go through and have a positive review of AD, The Bible Continues. So don't go away. We're going to be back here to part 2 in just a second. God bless. Well, welcome to part 2 of the program Christian Answers, and we're reviewing the recently aired mini-series on television called AD, The Bible Continues, by producers Mark Burnett and Roma Downey. And they have had experience in doing biblical stories because they did the Bible series a couple years ago, and then they did the movie Jesus last year, and now this year they're also doing a mini-series that is scheduled for 10 or 12 segments, and if it is a success and people watch it, they will have even more series coming. So we hope that people do tune in and view it, and we hope that there is a positive response on the viewers. But like I said in the first segment, I'm very positive about this series. It seems like it's going to follow the biblical narrative pretty closely. They do take creative license in some areas, but it seems like a harmless addition and harmless changes, and it doesn't really affect the story and the accounts in the biblical sense. So what are some of the things that they do that is very interesting and creative? Well, I think during the first episode, and we're only talking about the first episode of AD, The Bible Continues, we see that the producers are trying to fill in some of the characters that we don't normally get a lot of information about. For example, they show some of the background information about Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. And they show him and his wife talking about Jesus of Nazareth. They're trying to figure out what to do. As leaders in the Jewish community, Caiaphas and other Jews were very concerned about Jesus and his teachings because, of course, Jesus did not come up through the ranks, did not sit under their instruction, did not ask for their permission for his preaching, did not get official sanction from the Jewish religious establishments to teach what he was teaching. And so that was a great concern to the Jewish leaders like Caiaphas. And they did struggle in what to do. And Caiaphas ultimately came down on the side of Jesus must go. He needed to be gotten rid of. But others, Jews on the Sanhedrin Council, like Joseph of Arimathea, disagreed. And it shows a dialogue between Caiaphas and his wife and Joseph of Arimathea, and they were talking about what should be done about Jesus. Joseph, of course, was trying to say we should do nothing, we should not harm in any way this man, he's a fellow Jew, we should not hand him over to the Romans, and certainly not allow him to be executed, because after all, he is a brother Jew. And Caiaphas, on the other hand, the high priest, was saying, no, he's a danger to Israel, and if he becomes a danger to our nation, he will bring the Roman soldiers in with greater occupying force, and we will be under the heel of the Romans in an even greater way. So Jesus is a threat to the peace and stability and order of society. He must be eliminated. We must hand him over. He must die. He must be put to death for the greater good of the nation. And so there was that interesting dialogue that took place there. And of course, the Bible does not describe this dialogue between Caiaphas and Joseph of Arimathea, but it could have happened, and it probably did happen, but we just don't know if it did or not. Now, one of the other things that was very interesting was that it showed that after Jesus had been crucified and buried, it shows that the disciples, especially Mary, the mother of Jesus, talked about and actually did believe that Jesus would rise again on the third day, according to the prophecy that Jesus had given during his ministry. If you remember in the Bible, Jesus on a few occasions spoke of his death, and he also spoke of his resurrection in 3 days. And so the disciples had heard about that, and Mary had heard about it, and all of the followers of Jesus had heard about it. In fact, the enemies of Jesus, the Jewish high priests and scholars and Pharisees, they knew about the resurrection from the dead in 3 days prophecy that Jesus had said, because they went to Pilate and they said to him, Jesus said that he would rise again in 3 days, and so please send some soldiers to seal and guard the tomb so that his disciples do not come and steal the body of Jesus during the night and then claim somehow that the prophecy had been fulfilled and that he had been resurrected, and that would be worse than what we have now. There would be rumors, and there would be a whole superstition arise based on the empty tomb. So they said, please send soldiers and seal the tomb so that never can happen, and so we can end any potential mischief from occurring. Well, little did the Jewish leaders know that the disciples were not, in fact, according to the Bible, were not even thinking about resurrection. They were not hoping for the resurrection after 3 days. As far as we can tell, it doesn't tell us that they were hoping or waiting for the resurrection of Christ in 3 days. They were, in fact, discouraged, in despair, and depressed, thinking that everything was over, that they had wasted their time following Jesus because now he's dead and there's nothing more to be said. And so the Jewish leaders really didn't have anything to worry about, but they didn't know that. And so they were worried about the disciples somehow stealing the body. Now, they shouldn't have ever had to worry about that, because the disciples, as we know them, as the Bible shows, would never have resorted to some kind of a deception to try to manipulate a prophecy that Jesus gave during his lifetime, would not have manipulated circumstances such as stealing the body and then claiming that he had raised from the dead and then claiming that the prophecy had been fulfilled. The disciples would never have resorted to such deception. And then what? Spread the news that Jesus was alive when they knew it was not true, if they had stolen the body, stolen the dead corpse of Christ, to somehow convince people and followers around the area that Jesus had raised from the dead. That is totally against everything we know about Peter and the disciples. They never would have resorted to deception and lies to spread the truth. And they were about truth. They were about doing God's will. They were about all of the right things. And it really says more about the manipulation and the scheming minds of the Jewish high priests and the Jewish leadership and the Pharisees than it does about the disciples. The Jewish leaders were the manipulators. They were the ones that manipulated events to actually get Jesus Christ crucified. They were used to thinking like that, and so naturally they projected their kind of modus operandi on the disciples and went to Pilate and said, hey, we got to make sure that the disciples don't steal the body and claim the resurrection. So Pilate sent troops to guard the body of Jesus Christ, and the Pharisees and scribes and Jewish leaders were satisfied that nothing could go wrong with that. And so that is shown very clearly in the Bible series, the AD, the Bible Continues. But there's more to the story, and I'd like to talk about that in the third part of our program today. Don't go away. Well, welcome to the third and final part of our program today. We're talking about the mini-series that started last weekend called AD, The Bible Continues. And what that is about is a depiction of the Christian movement as it started after the resurrection of Christ. Now, what the Bible series episode shows is that, for example, Mary, the mother of Jesus, totally believed that Jesus would rise from the dead in 3 days, and she was telling the others about it. Mary Magdalene, it shows in the mini-series episode last weekend, was leaning and inclined to believe that Jesus would rise for the dead on the third day. But the other disciples were very much doubting that and didn't believe it at all. Although Peter, in the mini-series presentation, says, well, let's wait. Instead of fleeing Jerusalem, let's wait for the third day and see what indeed happens. Let's see if he does rise from the dead. And if he doesn't, then we'll flee the city. Because, see, they were very much afraid for their lives. They weren't sure what the Jewish authorities or the Romans were going to do with the followers of Jesus. They had just crucified and killed Jesus Christ. What would they do to his closest associates? Would they round them up? Would they round up the disciples and throw them in jail, or worse, actually crucify them also to make sure that the movement could never, ever even start or even get off the ground if that were going to happen at all? The disciples didn't know, and so they were hiding from the authorities. They were hiding from the Jewish people. They didn't really go out in public for 3 days. And the movie shows that they decided to wait. The few disciples that were still left in Jerusalem, they would wait in the place with Mary and Mary Magdalene and the others in John. They would wait for 3 days to see if Jesus rose from the dead, and if he didn't, then they would flee. If he did, well, praise God. Well, we don't know if that's the kind of dialogue that actually took place among the disciples. In fact, that kind of dialogue about this hope and this waiting for Jesus to rise from the dead, that is totally absent from the New Testament account. Everything in the New Testament account tends to support the claim that the disciples were discouraged, down in despair, and depressed because they concluded that they had been following a man who had a lofty vision but had died, and that was the end of it. They had hoped that he was the Messiah, but then again, they were thinking that if he were the Messiah, why would he die? Why would he be crucified? How could he allow himself to be captured and put to death if he was in fact the Messiah? And so the disciples, according to the Bible, and even there's no evidence that Mary, the mother of Jesus, held out hope for the resurrection after 3 days. There's no evidence that Mary Magdalene held out hope that Jesus would rise again after his death. There is no evidence that any follower, any believer, or any disciple of Jesus was waiting for 3 days to see if he would rise from the dead. According to the Bible, they weren't even thinking that way. They were thinking of everything is lost. All is lost. There's no point in going further. But yet the Bible series, AD, the Bible series, they actually recreate the scene as these disciples talking about this prophecy about 3 days later Jesus would rise from the dead. Now we know that Jesus did in fact say on a number of occasions that he would be crucified and then rise to life after the third day. And we know that the disciples heard him because Peter, in fact, after one of his prophecies that Jesus had prophesied that he would rise from the dead, but be put to death before that, Jesus said, "No, Lord, may it never be you put to death." And Jesus rebuked him for that, saying, yes, it has to be. But the part about the resurrection, it seems as if the disciples and everyone had just that had just gone over their heads and they had not really inputted it or taken it to heart, didn't really consider it. And so the Bible series is trying to recreate what the disciples thought, but maybe they didn't get that part exactly right. Now, there is a little shred of evidence that some of the followers of Jesus might possibly have entertained thoughts of the resurrection, because it says that the women on the third day, early in the morning, went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus for proper burial. And yet, along the way, they said, wait a minute, what about the stone? What about who will roll the stone away? And so they were going to the tomb of Jesus, but the question is, were they going there solely and only to anoint the body of Jesus for proper burial, or were they actually going there to see for themselves if, in fact, possibly Jesus had come to life and risen from the dead and the grave would be empty because of his resurrection? Now, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says that they went there to anoint the body for proper burial, and that's all it says. So if we are going to do any reading between the lines, we could possibly say that in the back of their minds they were hoping against hope that Jesus might not actually be in the tomb. They might not actually get to anoint the body for proper burial because Jesus might have risen from the dead. But we don't have any Bible evidence to actually say that that's what they thought. But it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting subject, trying to get into the mind of the disciples. And the Bible series, AD, The Bible Continues, tries to do that. It's a bold attempt. It's an honest attempt. But realistically, I think that the depiction of the disciples and of Mary, the mother of Jesus, talking about the prophecy of resurrection in 3 days, I think that actually is not technically accurate. I think more realistically is that they were saddened, they were down, they were depressed, they were despairing, they were trying to figure out, now what? Now what do we do? They were not thinking or even putting any hope that Jesus would be appearing to them in any form in a few days. I don't think that that was in their mind. And I think the Jewish leaders who went to Pilate and were worried about the disciples thinking about the prophecy and then trying to manipulate things were way off. If they had only known and seen the state of the disciples according to the Bible, they would never have been worried about the disciples trying to manipulate things or steal a body or try to make this prophecy fulfill. I think the disciples, according to all we know in the Bible, were not even thinking about the prophecy, and certainly would not have tried to manipulate the events such as stealing the body and then claiming a resurrection. They certainly would never have done that. So we will see what the episodes in the future do hold as far as how they depict the disciples and the early church as it grew. And it should be interesting to see how they interpret what the Bible is saying and how they fill in the blanks and how they round it out and depict the early Christian church. Because it gets us thinking, it gets us asking questions, and it gets us going deeper into our own faith. And that's a good thing. So I would encourage you all to watch the mini-series AD, The Bible Continues, and we'll see you back here next week with another episode.